Welcome to Pixel Composer tutorial. In this tutorial, I want to cover the basic of properties. Property is quite straightforward, but there are some small details, small complexity that can trip up a new user. So let's begin. The first thing I want to talk about is unit. When you create a generator node, you will see this dimension. This controls the size of the output surface. One thing that I got a lot of question about is what is this 1x mean, right? And 1x here is depend on the unit in the back. Not just dimension, but many other properties have different units you can switch between. And there are two types of units. There are absolute types and relative type. The absolute unit is basically the pixel unit. So when you hover on the end of the property here, it's a unit. And when you select pixel, that is the absolute type. So it says 64 by 64. If I change it to 32, then it would just be 32 by 32 pixel, right? And you can see in the output here. So this is absolute values. Now, if you click on the unit again, here it says global, and it says 0.5x. The x here indicates that it is a relative unit. Now you need to know what it is relative to. In this case, it is relative to a global properties. And where is the global dimension property is in your project setting. So you have to exit from the node by double click in an empty space to your project setting. You will see that there are dimension property here. This is your global dimension properties. So it's set to 64 by 64. And in this node, it says 0.5x. So it's 0.5 or half of 64, which is 32. And as you change the dimension property here, I change it to 128, you will see that the node itself would also update to match the global dimension. In some node, there's also a mass unit. So this is also another relative unit. As you can see, you have the x at the end there. But this one will be relative to the mass input. So here the mass, right? Because we have the mass, it's just going to be 1 by 1. And the output here is 128 times 1 by 1. But most of the time, you're only going to deal with the pixel, absolute unit, and the global relative unit. Another place you're gonna see unit is in a lot of the vector 2 values. So stuff like position, xy scale, or in this case in the draw gradient node, the center point property here control the center point of your gradient. Here it says 0.5, 0.5, right? And you see the x at the end again. It means that it is a relative unit. If you hover at the end, you're gonna say the current unit, and the naming here is a little bit different. We still have the same pixel unit. This is the absolute, right? 64 pixel. But now the relative units are called fraction. So what is this value relative to? Well, for other non-dimension properties, the fractional or the relative unit will relative to the node dimension itself. If that node have dimension properties, then that is the node dimension, right? In this case, the dimension property is 1x in the global scale. So you can see it's just a chain of relation, right? We have dimension relative to the global dimension, and then we have this center relative to the node dimension. Now you can switch it back to pixel. In this case, I set the pixel position to 64 by 64, right? That's the middle of a 128 pixel. But one thing to be careful of is when you set the unit to be absolute units, and then you make a modification to dimension, like you go to the project setting, and you want to scale down your project, you will see that the center point here is shift to the bottom right? It didn't stay in the middle. That's because we set it to absolute unit or pixel unit, right? So it's just gonna stay at 64 by 64. But that's why most property that by default it use fractional or relative units so that you can scale things non-destructively. Now some nodes can have a relative unit without a dimension input. Like in this case, you can see it have this fractional unit, but there is no dimension properties. In that case, you're gonna use dimension of the surface input as its base dimension. In this blur node, you will see that the value that have fractional unit is actually a scalar number. So it's not like an xy position like this, it's just one number. If that's the case, when you set it to fractional unit, it will relative to only the width of your surface. Another value with different unit is 3D rotation, but you're probably not gonna interact with it that much. Like with the 3D cube here, you're gonna see in the rotation, we have two units you can select between, Euler and quaternion. Realistically, you're only gonna work with like Euler rotation in the XY rotation because it makes more sense. The second thing I want to cover is the mappable parameter. So I already covered this in the displacement video. In some property, you're gonna see that there are this map icon at the end. Look like this. If you mouse over on it, you're gonna say toggle map. What it means is that you can vary the values of this number per pixel. For example, we have this size control, right? As you increase the size of the blurring, we will see that it will blur more or less. However, it will apply blurring equally across the entire image. If you want to give it some variety, like for example, you want to create like a tilt shift effect, you want to have like a non-uniform blur size across the image, you will need to use the mappable parameter. So you just click on toggle map. The first thing is that the scalar value here, the one single value will turn into 2. But you have to define the range of value you want to set. In this case, you say that the sharpest point here should be non-blur, right? Should have the amount of 0. So we can say minimum to 0, and the maximum could be whatever you want. Next thing you want to do is you want to provide a map surface to tell each pixel what number in between this 0 and 14 it should be. And it uses the same principle of the black pixel being 0, the white pixel being 1. So we're gonna give it some basic gradient when you connect it to the size map. So the name of the junction here will take the same name as the properties plus the word map. So if you map the size, you have to connect it to a size map. And as I connect to it, you already see that the blur amount is differ. This gradient, the black area on the left, so the left will be less blurry, and the white area on the right, so the white area being more blurry. If you want to do like the tilt shift effect I'm talking about, we can rotate the gradient 90 degrees and then give it some gradient like this, right? So the middle region here is black, so it's gonna be completely sharp. Go up and down, it becomes more and more blur. Now in the gradient node, you will see that the gradient values also have this map icon, but the gradient mapping work a little bit different with the number mapping. So I'm gonna give you example. When you click on the gradient map like this, the gradient looks the same, but you will have this new input called gradient map. If you try to connect other surface to it, something weird would happen. Now when you click on the node with this gradient mapping, you will see this blue line. And this is the sampling part. So basically what happened is it will just sample color between 0.1 to 0.2, and it's gonna take each color on this line as a gradient. If I change the gradient types to be like 0 degree, you will see that it basically just sample this line and then extend it out to become its own gradient. Like if I want to create a gradient like this, it can be a little bit annoying to have to go to the gradient editor and then add in like white and then black and then white and then black and then white and black. And this way, if I just sample directly from the node that already output these black and white patterns, I can control the pattern amount, the pattern size, without having to go and play around with the keyframe in here. But it's also easier to animate as well. Then I'm gonna talk about a smaller feature that you can do with the properties. First, you can favorite your properties. Is it in, I think, the latest beta, right? You're gonna see this star shape here in front of the property. If you click on it, it's just gonna mark it as favorite so that your property will show up when you exit out of the node. Next thing is bypass. If you want to reuse a value in one properties in another properties. Like in this example, maybe I want to reuse the red color here in other node, right? But the red color is an input. You cannot connect one input to another. First thing you can do is just extract the value out. You can click and drag the value here to the graph panels. You're gonna extract out to its own node, and they can connect it to the other node. The other way you can do is you can do value bypass by right clicking on the properties, and you will see here it's a toggle bypass. Right? If I click on it, it's just gonna create new output with the same property name, and it's just gonna bypass the input here to the output so that you can reuse it in other node. Right? And this way you change the values, you're gonna see that it also updates in all the other nodes as well. And that should be it for the basic of properties. You should play around with this stuff, especially with Mappable Parameter. I have accidentally created like a lot of interesting image just by playing around with different mapping values, mapping surface. So I hope this video is useful for you. So thank you everyone for watching. Special thanks for all the Patreon supporter, and see you in the next one.